So today we've gathered here to celebrate the whole reason that the Christian church exists. And that reason is really simple. The reason is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And for Christians, that's not some kind of weird folklore. It's actually true. Someone once asked the great Protestant theologian Karl Barth, who was a university professor, they said, and this is a very Canberra kind of question, I think, what kind of scientific basis is there to teach theology at universities? What do you say, Professor Barth? And Karl said, it's very simple. The scientific basis for theology to be a university subject is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So it's simple. And if you look at the very early sermons, we've got two examples in our readings today. One is Peter speaking to people in the first weeks of the church's life. What's his sermon? What's his message? It's really simple. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And he's preaching it to people who were around at the time of the crucifixion, who knew what had happened. And Peter was able to convince them that this was a truth for which people were prepared to give their lives as martyrs. Extraordinary. You know, good middle-class Christians like me are very suspicious of these things these days. Martyrdom sounds like a lot of hard work. Worse than that, it sounds rather embarrassing. But that's Peter's message, and that is the heart of the good news that built the church. And then Mary, the very first ever sermon, if you like. All she had to say was, I have seen the Lord. Mary testified to other people that she had met the risen Jesus and her life had been transformed. Now, I don't know how many people today in this church have had a personal encounter with Jesus that was so real that it was like a vision or an apparition, though these things do still happen. But I think pretty much all of us who are regular members of this church can testify in one way or another that we have had a personal encounter with the reality of the risen Jesus. It has transformed our life, and that is what we are doing here when a lot of other people are at the folk festival or playing football or doing whatever else people do on Sundays these days. But it's interesting, isn't it? I think there are two risks that we need to avoid on Easter Sunday. And the first risk is of those of us who've been hanging around the church so long that we think that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is normal and obvious. We need to rediscover the strangeness of this event. The fact that it is completely unprecedented, the fact that it is a one-off, the fact that it is frankly improbable and rather unbelievable. The fact that Jesus' friends who were with him for 3 years, who listened to his teaching, who had some inkling of who he was, found it incredibly hard to believe themselves, and some of them just refused to. The resurrection is strange. It's not supposed to be obvious or easy to understand. And those of us, like me, who've been hanging around the church since we were kids, need to rediscover that sense of how odd it is to found an entire religion on what we hold to be a historical fact that seems to many people to be completely unbelievable. We need to get back into that space sometimes. But then the other risk is the risk I've just been talking about, the risk of saying, because it seems implausible, it can't be true. Many of our contemporaries think that. There may be people in this church today who think that, who are here on Easter for a variety of reasons, but think that, frankly, this resurrection thing, it's a bit silly. It's a bit implausible. There are lots of other good reasons to have religion, but that's maybe not one of them. And as Christians, we have to ask the question, well, we are claiming that the resurrection is that weird, but that doesn't mean it's not true. Maybe despite the fact that it's a one-off, despite the fact that it's implausible, despite the fact that no one would have come up with this in their right mind. Maybe actually those are reasons why this should be taken seriously, at least as a possibility, and maybe for many of us as a truth which has changed our lives. But one of the things I find really interesting is that in the wisdom of the church, there's an awareness that the resurrection needs some time for us to come to terms with. It's interesting, isn't it, that generally in modern culture, people are dimly aware of a season called Lent. This long period of time we prepare ourselves for Easter by giving up chocolate, or whatever we do, or going to the gym a bit more. I think that's called salvation by works in the trade. Now, we have chocolate today because it's good to celebrate with chocolate. And some of us had champagne for breakfast as well, as it happens. If you want that, you have to come at 6 a.m. next year, okay? But the church gives us a whole season, longer actually than Lent, the season of Easter. And we're just starting it today. We have a whole month and a half in the church's year to come to terms with the strangeness of Easter and to do what many of us have been doing in the last little while in our Lent course, to take time to meditate on these strange stories of Jesus turning up and visiting people, bringing them new hope, new life, new understanding, community, learning, service, and then outreach. In fact, what Jesus does in those first Easter days gives us a model for the whole life of the church. It's what we try to do here in Holy Cross. And we have ahead of us the whole season of Easter to read those stories, to think about how amazing they are, and to see what for us encountering again the risen Jesus might mean. Because actually the final proof that Christ is actually risen, and I'm afraid to say this because it touches us all to the heart, but the final proof that Jesus is actually risen is our behaviour as the church, as Christians. We are the proof that the resurrection is real. And we have the responsibility to model in our lives as individuals, but more importantly as a community, the plausibility of God's living presence with us. That's what the whole of this stuff with the bread and the wine and the water is about. Signs that we taste already that risen miraculous life, which transforms us as a community, which should make us so attractive, not because of who we are, but because of who God has made us. That people will be drawn to that light because they ask that same question. Where is hope? Where is joy to be found? And we as Christians have the responsibility of saying, it's not from us, but let us introduce you to the risen Jesus. Let us leave you with him. And let us share with you the joy that we have found in following him, a joy that has transformed our lives. Amen.